down. Like that. Okay. This week we're continuing. This is our last week in this quarter. So we're going to finish up in 1 Samuel. We're going to start off in 2 Samuel, the first few chapters. So we're looking at 1 Samuel chapter 31 today, the first 4 chapters in 2 Samuel, and then Chronicles, 1 Chronicles chapter 10. And then we'll have a break from the Old Testament. We'll go back to the New Testament for the fall quarter, and then we'll come back and talk about David some more come winter. But where we're at today, you remember David had aligned himself with the Philistines, had been living with them in their territory. He had actually marched with them against the Israel army. And fortunately, God saw fit to deliver David from that problem of having to face his own people. And then he goes back to Ziklag, his hometown, and he finds that they've been raided by the Amalekites. And God, he sought God's guidance, and God told him that he would recover everybody and everything and would defeat the Amalekites. And so he did that. And while he was doing that, while that was going on, you remember that Saul had sought God's advice, but not very strongly. He just kind of, in passing, asked God, what should I do? And of course, God had removed himself from Saul. And then Saul went to a meeting. He went to a witch. And she didn't conjure up Samuel. Samuel was sent by God to talk to Saul and to tell Saul that his end was near. And so that's where we're picking up today in 1 Samuel 31, the first 6 verses. Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell down slain in Mount Gilboa. And the Philistines followed hard upon Saul and upon his sons. And the Philistines slew Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, Saul's sons. And the battle went sore against Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was sore wounded of the archers. Then Saul said unto his armor-bearer, draw thy sword, and thrust me through therewith, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and abuse me. But his armor-bearer would not, for he was sore afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell upon him. And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he fell likewise upon his sword and died with him. So Saul died, and his 3 sons, and his armor-bearer, and all his men, that same day together. So we see the battle between Israel and the Philistines. And God had told his anointed king of Israel that he was going to die that day. And that's what happened. But it says here that his sons died first, and he had been told that, and he knew that his sons were going to die. And then the archers, the battle, it says here the battle went sore against Saul. It went greatly against Saul. And that's what the sore means here. It's interesting that the word sore is used 3 times here, meaning greatly or enhanced, or just, the things were bad. This was devastating to Israel. Saul asked his armor-bearer, because he said that he didn't want the Philistines to kill him because he knew that they would desecrate his body. And he didn't want to die at their hand. He didn't want his enemy to be the one to kill him. But his armor-bearer was scared to death. He couldn't do it. And so Saul took his own life. He had been hit with arrows. He was dying. And so he fell on his own sword. And his armor-bearer did likewise. One of the things that we need to keep in mind here, when this armor-bearer, he was afraid. He was greatly afraid to do that, because he probably knew in his mind that it's not right to take the king's life. And two, we have Saul here taking his own life, though, and that's not right either. It tells us here in the text, the author that wrote our text, no one has the right to take his life that God gave him. So, once again, in his dying breath, here's Saul doing something contrary to God's will. Someone that started out so great and then ended up so lost and confused. Saul had got to the point where he could no longer use Saul. Saul was unworthy in God's eyes. And, that's a tough thing to think about. That a person has gone so far away from God and His will that there's no longer anything that God can do for him. That it's done. It's over. And so Saul's life came to an end, just as God had told him, just as God had told him through Samuel. And not only did Saul's unworthiness towards God and his disobedience toward God cost him his life, it cost the lives of thousands of other people of Israel. It cost those thousands of people that died because of Saul's insubordinance towards God, about him just doing what he wants to do. There was all these people died, and then not only that, the people, the Israeli people, the people that lived in that area where the Philistines came, they were so scared because the army was so devastated. They packed up and left town. They just see this is territories, and David was gaining territories too, but this is the promised land. This is the land that God had given to Israel, and they had fought for it. And they didn't always fight in the right way, and they didn't always follow God's will, and they were still having to fight and scratch for the land that God had promised them, and they just ceded it to their enemy. They just gave up and left. They just headed out. And his death was terrible. And David is back at Ziklag, and we're fixing to see, we're going to see how David responded to that. But in the meantime, an Amalekite happened upon the scene at Mount Gilead, a young Amalekite. And he saw King Saul. And he goes to Ziklag. He goes to David. Because he's thinking, all these people knew each other, and all these people knew everyone knew that David was the anointed successor to Saul. And people were continually going to David and looking for some kind of reward. And so this Amalekite shows up in town, and in Ziklag, and he tells David that King Saul has died. And not only has King Saul died, but I killed him. I've got proof here. I've got his crown, and I've got the bracelet from his arm that I took from him. He had been hit, and the Philistines were about to take him, and I killed him for you, David. I took his life for you. Now, it's interesting here that David then asks the guy, who are you? And he tells him, I'm an Amalekite. And David turns to his people, and he tells them to kill this Amalekite, because he has killed God's anointed. He has slain God's anointed, so his punishment is death. And it's interesting in that this is an Amalekite. You remember when David went after the Amalekites had raided Ziklag, and David went after them, and they fought for 24 hours, and it was a great army. We talked about it was a big army, and only 400 got away. Only 400. 400 young Amalekites got away. Is this one of the young Amalekites that got away and found himself then at Gilead and found himself? I wouldn't doubt that he's sitting there thinking and knowing what David had done and what David had done to his people. Maybe now I'm going to do something to try to get in on God's good graces. But he lied about it. He didn't kill Saul. He lied and said that he did, thinking that there was a reward waiting for him. And he found out what was awaiting him when you are disobedient to God and when you lie about things. And so David had the Amalekite slain. And so then David is mourning Saul and his best friend Jonathan's death. And that's what we pick up in verse 23 through 27 in 2 Samuel chapter 1. Saul and Jonathan were lovely and pleasant in their lives, and in their death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. Ye daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in scarlet and other delights, who put on ornaments of gold upon your apparel. How are the mighty fallen in the midst of the battle? O Jonathan, thou wast slain in thine high places. I am distressed for thee, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant hast thou been unto me. Thy love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. How are the mighty fallen, and the weapons of war perished? This is just a small segment of a song that David wrote. A tribute to King Saul, to God's anointed king of Israel. All these years, for 10 years, David avoided Saul, ran from Saul, did everything he could to keep Saul from killing him, but he never lost respect for the position of him being the anointed king of Israel, of him being anointed by God to be the king. And it wasn't David's right to take Saul's life. The only person who could end the kingdom of Saul was God. And David was respectful of that. And he did God's will and what God's wishes were in response to that. And David was truly mournful of the fact that the king of Israel had been killed. And not only that, his best friend Jonathan. His best friend who has a relationship of, it's just, we can't really describe it, I guess, or put it in words, how strong their relationship was, because Jonathan had proven himself to David and had given up his right to the throne for David. He had shown David that it's God's will that I wish to follow. And that's what the two of them did. The two of them were joined together following God's will. That was what was in their heart and was their desire for their life, was to do what God wished for them to do. And that's what David, and not only that, David is telling all the people of Israel, he's not piling on. Saul's dead. And he wants people to remember the good. Saul did some terrible things, but he did some great things. He did some good things in his life. And that's what Saul is being remembered for here. That's what David wants the people of Israel to remember and to be respectful in death, just as they should have been respectful in his life of the king and what he had done for him. He says here that David was a man who reacted to Saul's death as God did. It sorrowed God that he had made Saul king and had to bring Saul to such a pitiful end. That kind of hits hard when you stop to think about it. It's not just Saul. It's any of God's children. God made each and every one of us. We are all a part of his creation. And we were all created to do a work for God. God wills each and every one of us to live our lives for him, to bring honor and glory to him. And God, just the same as it sorrowed God when he saw, when he reflected back on Saul's life, it would sorrow God if he had to reflect back on one of our lives. And all he could see was our failures and not our accomplishments for him. And it would sorrow those around us. So that should motivate us just the same. It's not just, there's untold things that God has done for each and every one of us. And the last thing we want to do, it's bad enough when we let somebody down, be it a friend or a family member or our supervisor at work or a boss, and they're expecting something out of you, and you don't accomplish that. You don't follow through with it, and for whatever reason, you don't get where they wanted you to get to, and you let them down. And how bad that makes you feel, knowing that you let someone down that believed in you. Just think how much more that is to know that we could possibly let God down. And He believes in us so much that He sent Jesus Christ to die on the cross for each and every one of us. There's no other way to show people His belief in us than to send His only Son to die on the cross for us. So then 1 Chronicles 10, 13, and 14. So Saul died for his transgression, which he committed against the Lord, even against the word of the Lord, which he kept not, and also for asking counsel of one that had a familiar spirit to inquire of it, and inquired not of the Lord. Therefore he slew him, and turned the kingdom unto David, the son of Jesse. Saul died because he disobeyed God. And it wasn't just this one time that he disobeyed God. But I guess you could say this was the last straw. This was the end. And it's, as it said here, it's revisiting what we talked about last week and what we talked about earlier, is Saul, in passing, turned to God because of the problem that lay before him, the Philistine army. But he didn't mean it in his heart. He didn't have any, it was just, he was just giving lip service to it. And God already knew this. God had already withdrawn from Saul because He knew Saul was done. But yet Saul put a lot of effort into trying to talk to Samuel, into helping him through what he thought was the efforts of the witch, when in fact it was nothing more than God sending Samuel to talk to Saul. He says here that he wasted the opportunity to serve the Lord faithfully and receive great rewards in heaven. How many of God's children have done the same? That's what Saul did. Saul wasted all these opportunities that God placed before him. And setting the application, he says here, to be a mighty warrior or authoritative king pales in comparison to being a faithful servant of the Lord. To be the GOAT, the greatest of all time, in your given sport, or the President of the United States, is not comparable to being a humble servant of the Lord. Think of the greatest thing that the world bestows upon people as being an honor or something. That greatest honor that you think could be bestowed upon any one person here in the world pales in comparison to being a humble servant to the Lord. Not even in the same realm. Jesus said being the greatest in this kingdom is about being humble and being a servant. But how many of us really believe in that and live that way? Saul wanted to be great not in serving the Lord but in ruling people. He became jealous of his rival David, who was really not his rival. David was chosen by God to replace Saul as king, yet Saul would not submit to the Lord's will and serve him. Instead, he served himself. He did everything he could to hang on to his rulership and took his life in the process. When we are not interested in serving the Lord, but only in seeking our own greatness, it is a plan for failure. Even if we succeed by worldly standards, we are failures in God's eyes. Someone wisely said, any equation without God always equals zero. So you take anything and multiply it times zero, meaning God's not around, the answer is zero. It always is. That's the simplest equation to figure out. If God's not in it, Not going to happen. Shouldn't happen. You don't need to be there. You don't need to be a part of that. And so, two other points that I wanted to point out that they didn't touch on in our lesson here, but are in the verses. And if you read through commentaries about this, you'll see this and talk about it and realize it. But it wasn't just a quick transition from Saul's dead, David was anointed king, now David's the king of Israel. That didn't happen. David was crowned king of Judah, just the one tribe. But he served as king of Judah for 7 years and 6 months. Not the king of Israel for those 7 years. So this is now, he goes 17 and a half years after having been anointed to be the king of Israel before he is crowned the king of Israel. But in this time, Saul's dead. David has mourned Saul. He's written this. When you look in literature and you talk about, people have read what David penned about Saul and Jonathan. I mean, it's considered one of the greatest literary pieces ever written, ever, period. And it's really a great piece that he wrote, and he was truly sorrowful for the loss of his king. And so he's crowned as the king. And one of the things, well, he's crowned king of Judah, but Ishbosheth is another son of Saul. And Joab leads David's army. And you remember Abner, he was the leader of Israel's army. Abner didn't die in the battle that Saul died in. You remember Abner was the one that was laying right beside Saul when David walked into camp while they were sleeping and took the spear and took the bottle of water and then hollered back at Abner, kind of disrespecting him and just telling you're not even taking care of your king, and it's evident because Abner survived the battle and Saul didn't. So Abner goes and sees to it that Ishbosheth is crowned king of Israel, of the other tribes. And it's interesting, they get word to each other. And these are people that are fighting amongst themselves. These are all the children of Israel. These are all of the 12 tribes. And instead of taking care of what God's will was and taking the promised land and taking care of God's enemies, they're fighting amongst themselves. They get word to each other, and Joab and Abner bring their armies together, and they decide to take 12 of the best men and put them out there and let them fight each other. You know, it's kind of like when Goliath was out there, and whoever best the other, then the other army will be subservient to them. And so they take all 12 of them out there, and it must have been a sight because all 12 of them did exactly the same thing. Each one of them grabbed the opponent's beard. Imagine this. 6 people lined up on one side here and 6 on that side. Each one of them grabbed the opponent's beard and took their sword and drove it into the other one's side. All 12 of them at the same time fell dead because they all did. So it accomplished nothing. And so then they started fighting, and Abner's running away, and Joab just happens to have a little brother that happens to be the fastest in the land. He was as swift as a gazelle, and he was chasing after Abner. And Abner told him, I guess this is something that Abner might have done at the battle with the Philistines. Abner told him, don't come after me. Turn right or turn left, and go get one of the younger guys and slay them. That's what he told him. Go take one of my other guys and kill them and leave me alone. Well, that's a great leader right there. And he wouldn't do it. He was closing in on Abner, and Abner took his spear and the butt of it and thrust it backwards right into, I don't remember the brother's name, but it's Joab's little brother, right into his stomach, and he died right there. So Joab, his little brother is killed by Abner. So now we got a blood feud going on. Now we got families mad at each other. And they chased him on, and finally Abner, from a high point, yelled down at Joab and said, look, we need to stop this. We need to quit. We need to go back. And in fact, it was Abner's army that lost, I think it was 200 or 300 people that day. And Joab only lost maybe, I think it was 20 people, and his army died. So they might have, what you could say, won the battle or whatever. But so Abner goes back, and his king that he helped anoint was Ishbosheth, like we said. And Ishbosheth, this is interesting what his name means. This is the remaining son of Saul. And his name, Ishbosheth, means man of shame. But that's just, they call it a nickname because his original name was Ishbaal or Ishbaal, meaning man of Baal. Meaning, here's a child of Israel that's named after a pagan god. And so the people, instead of calling him Ishbaal, just finally changed his name to man of shame, because it had to be shameful to be named after a pagan god. Saul named a son after a pagan god. I mean, just one more time that he was ignoring God's will. You know God didn't want Saul to name his son after a pagan god. But Abner got mad at Ishbosheth because Ishbosheth found out that Abner was with one of Saul's women and told him not to do that. You can't do that. And so Abner had a couple of his guys go and actually slay Ishbosheth in his bed and take his head to David, to let David know that the king of Israel is dead. And David had a similar response to those two that presented Ishbosheth's head to him, because this was the son of the original king of Israel. And the disrespect that they showed him by slaying him on his bed, David had those two gentlemen killed. He had them executed. And then, so that's where we're going to end there in 2 Samuel. That's where we're going to pick up, where David is now David's about to be anointed king of Israel. But there's one other point that I wanted to make that was back before this, that happened right after Saul was killed in the battle. And it's not talked about here, but again, it's one of those things, if you start reading through the commentaries and reading about what these guys did and what these guys risked for what they did, you remember in reading through the verses that Saul killed himself. And then this Amalekite came and took his crown and took his bracelet and went to David. The Philistines went and celebrated that night that they had defeated the army of Israel. And the next day they went out onto the battlefield to go and see what they could take, see what they could scrounge up from the dead. You know, their spoils of war. And they go and they find King Saul. They don't find his crown and they don't find his bracelet on his arm, of course, but they know it's King Saul. They all know each other well, so they know this is King Saul. And they take the king's body. Just as Saul had been afraid of letting the Philistines kill him because of what they would do to him, they did it anyway, even though he took his own life. They cut his head off and they took his body and Jonathan's body and his other two brothers' bodies, and they took them. They took his armor. They shipped his armor all over their territory, bragging to the people, look what we did to Saul, here's his armor. And they took his body and they nailed his body and his son's bodies up on the wall in town and cut his head off, displaying him as a trophy. Now, there's a town called Jabesh Gilead. And I told you that all the people of Israel abandoned their towns. They were so scared. They were so afraid because the army of Israel had been defeated. They all left. They left the territory. They ceded it to the Philistines, except for Jabesh Gilead and the men of that town. They marched 15 miles one way that night, the night that the Philistines had taken Saul's body and nailed him up on the wall. I guess they had spies. Maybe somebody was watching to see what happened, but they came back and they reported, and they marched 15 miles to that town, and they took their king's body off the wall, and they took his son's body off the wall, and they took their heads and they took them back to their land, and they burned their bodies, and they gathered up their bones and they buried their bones, so that there was no trophy for the Philistines to display. They had not forgotten, because I also told you that Saul did some good things. Saul wasn't always a bad person. He didn't always go against God's will. He did some good things, and most of the good things were early on in his rulership. Because 40 years earlier, Saul was the only one that answered a cry from a town of Jabesh Gilead, who had been attacked by the Ammonites. And Saul gathered up men, and he went and he battled the Ammonites and rescued the town of Jabesh Gilead. And those people never forgot what their king had done for them. They never forgot what Saul did for them, their king. And this is what I found in one of the commentaries. The secret behind faithful and courageous actions when others flee, like all the Israelites did, is remembering the king, remembering what had been done for them. They had not forgotten. And that was their secret, to having the courage and the faithfulness to go and pull Saul's body off that wall and take him back and treat him and keep him from being desecrated anymore by him. And that's what I wanted to end with, when you stop and you think about what those people did, because they remembered what the king had done for them. That we never forget what the king has done. Never forget what our king has done for us. And we'll always find the faith and the courage to do whatever his will is for our lives. And with that, I'd like us to go to Lord in prayer. Heavenly Father, we come to you this morning so thankful again for this day, this opportunity to revisit your word, to see what you have to share with us about your chosen David, and to know and to see how this can apply to our lives. It's just so exciting, Lord, to know that you speak to us through your word, through our Bible, each and every time we pick it up. There's always something there that you wish to direct individually to us. It's just my prayer, Lord, that we continue in our study of your word and do our level best to apply it to our lives, to continually seek your will in our lives, not only individually, but as Mount Zion. And we ask, Lord, that you continue to bless the services this morning, Brother Dale, and your words that you've placed on his heart that he'll be presenting to us. And to know, Lord, and for us to put it in our heart to never forget what the King has done, to never forget what your Son, Jesus Christ, did for each and every one of us on the cross. I ask forgiveness of my sins and where I fail you. In your Son, Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Any new quarterlies